Before we had children, I didn't know much about Thomas the Tank Engine. No doubt I watched it as a child, but none of that stayed inside of my head. And so I've learnt, or perhaps I've relearnt, a lot about Thomas. Depending on when you, your children or your grandchildren were born, will determine which version of Thomas the Tank Engine that you remember. So in our house we have a set of the original books that were reprinted in their original form with the same illustrations. And I'll be honest with you, I think the characters in those original versions look quite creepy, the way that they've been drawn, the way they've been illustrated. If you haven't seen the modern TV series, they're all computer animated, and Thomas and his friends look much, much more friendly. There's a range of different series and of short films, and one of those short films is called The Tale of the Brave. And the message is essentially that being brave is not about whether you are scared or not. Being brave is about doing something even when you are scared. Zach, our eldest, recently turned 4, and as part of the day out for his birthday, he was playing on the playground, and Zach's not always very confident climbing on some of the larger bits of the play equipment. And when he was on one of the parts of the play equipment that he found a bit scary, he said afterwards, "I was brave, even though I was scared." As I read today's Gospel reading where Peter asks if he can join Jesus on the water, that moment of Zach on the play equipment came to my mind, where Peter is clearly brave and he did something that most of us, I cannot imagine, would even think to do, and yet in this moment of bravery, that is when he begins to sink. So last week we heard about the feeding of the 5,000, and that story of the feeding of the 5,000 occurs just before today's reading. And following the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus goes up to a mountain to pray by himself when the disciples go across the Sea of Galilee in their fishing boats. And some of these men are professional fishermen after all. And it seems like it's quite a windy night and the waves are a bit larger than normal. And we don't get a great deal of detail in the story. I'm presuming it's not quite the size of the storm that Jesus calmed, but it's clearly not a calm, still sea either. So it's probably a bit of a choppy sea, and so they're a bit frightened. And in that context, if you're in a choppy sea, and if you were in your boat and you saw a figure on the water, I wonder how you would respond. No doubt with the same kind of reactions that the disciples did, with a bit of fear and confusion and wondering what on earth was going on, who on earth this person was. And so if we take this moment, this point at which the disciples look out to the sea and they see this strange figure walking on the water, the way that Jesus is presented as this strange ghostly figure seems to represent how most people, or at least a lot of people, view Jesus today, where most people know a little bit about Jesus, but he seems to be this ghostly figure who is a little bit strange and elusive. They don't quite know what to make of him. They don't also hang around long enough to find out. They have more important things to do, or are too distracted by their busy lives. And as we see here, even those who believe in Jesus don't always know what to expect from him. And so in this moment of confusion, seeing this figure on the water, the disciples respond by trying to rationalize the situation, which is, I think, a natural response. And they presume the figure was a ghost. After all, it couldn't be a real person, could it? And in that moment, Jesus tells them that it is him. He tells them, it is I. He tells them not to be afraid. And so just for a moment, just think about this. They're out in the middle of a choppy sea, and they see someone on the water, and they're being told by Jesus not to be afraid. Well, what else are they going to be apart from to be afraid? What on earth is going on in this situation. We can also take a step back, and we can take this story as a whole, and we can take it to be a picture of the life of faith, where 1 minute everything seems to be going okay, and in the next minute we are in the middle of a storm. Sound familiar? We're all surrounded by this confusing situation. We are in the middle of a collective storm together. And once the disciples realize that it is Jesus, it's then that Peter asks Jesus to tell him to join him on the water. In other words, joining Jesus on the water is not something that Peter can do on his own. Peter needs the invitation and the reassurance of Jesus. And so as Peter steps onto the water, what we see is that he is caught between this moment of glory and of terror, between the realities of life and faith. We know life has the ability to throw all kinds of storms our way. And when we are surrounded by these storms, our natural tendency is therefore fear, not faith. And so this moment of Peter is therefore, for Peter and for us more generally, a picture of the life of faith, or perhaps more accurately, a picture of the life of half faith, that is, faith mixed with fear and with doubt. And so I wonder, over the last few months, or more generally in your life, where you would sit on the scale of life and faith, where on the one hand, on the one end of the scale, you've got faith that means complete trust in Jesus, and at the other end of the scale, life and the realities of the storm take over our mind. We obviously need to recognize that the life of faith is not faith without the storm, it is faith in the midst of the storm. And so as we think about where we sit on that scale between life and faith, it's perhaps reassuring that Peter is this figure, this character, this person who clearly seesaws between which has a stronger influence in his life, the reality of life or faith. And so as we look at Peter, if you had the choice between the friends who did what seemed to be the right thing but worried about it later, very impulsive, or the friend who spent so much time thinking about a decision through that it takes weeks to get anything done, in Peter we obviously see somebody who is very impulsive and reactionary. And here he impulsively wants to get out of the boat, but the realities soon become obvious. Just before Jesus' crucifixion is another example of where Peter swings between the life and faith. And at the crucifixion of Jesus, he denies he even knew Jesus. And yet, with this character who swings between life and faith, Peter is the rock on which Jesus will build his church. So as Peter is on the choppy water, he does not begin to sink and then becomes frightened, but he becomes frightened and so he begins to sink. And so what we see is that losing sight of Jesus means that Peter, like all of us, cannot help but become frightened. He focuses too much on what is around him and not on Jesus. That is when he becomes frightened. That is when he begins to sink. Now, I think it's also important to say that walking on water, in the literal sense, wasn't something that the early Christians expected to do themselves. And so, for example, Paul, on his missionary journeys, facing yet another shipwreck, never imagined that getting out of the boat and strolling off to shore was a viable option. And so what this story, I think, is about is Matthew expecting his readers or his listeners to hear this story in terms of their own journey of faith, their own struggles between life, the realities of life and faith, their own struggles with doubt and confusion and all that's going on around them. And so what Jesus asks us to do, as we think about our life of faith, perhaps we've been called to do a particular thing maybe it's a particular task, we can feel completely ill-equipped for it. In our life of faith, perhaps it's a sin that is so ingrained in our being, or perhaps it's being asked to take up a pattern of prayer when our life is already so frantic and disorganized. If we think about how we respond, what our life of faith looks like, if we, like Peter, only ever look at the waves around us, the conclusion we will have is that it's impossible. We cannot do this. We will become frightened. We'll take our eyes off Jesus and we will begin to sink. So, for example, for me personally, over the last 4 and a bit years, when I've been the vicar of Kirkleatham Parish, I have at times thought that my task is impossible. Most obviously, although not just this, I have wondered if we would ever have a new St Hilda's Church. And somehow, through the grace of God and what looks like is going to be the biggest global recession since World War II, we will have a new church. And so what we are called to do, which is basic and obvious, but hard to do in practice, is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and our ears open for his encouragement. Our wills and our hearts must be ready to do what he says, even if it seems crazy, even if it seems impossible at the time. Through this collective storm that we are going through at the moment, as we journey towards some kind of new normal, Jesus says, keep your eyes on me. Don't focus on the ever-changing situation. We obviously need to be aware of it. We need to respond to it. But the choppy waves are not our focus. Jesus is our focus. And so remember that with Jesus, everyone is far more capable than they ever think that they are. We just need to remember to look to Jesus, not on our own abilities or the storms around us. Amen.